chapter. After gaining the demonic power of electricity, 9 years had passed by, and Owen, having chosen a nomadic life to propagate the stories of his tribal chief and their deity, encountered Hui, an intriguing traveler from automation. Hui was venturing through the wilderness with a specific goal, and that is to reach the Lizardman tribe and convey a message from the Lord of Automation to RECAPS, the tribal chief. Luckily for Hui, Owen himself was also planning to return to the Lizardman tribe, and so he was kindly offered a ride, thereby aiding his journey and mission. Concurrently, the Lizardman tribe was journeying through the wilderness when they were compelled to halt abruptly. The reason for their sudden stop was the critical condition of Stargazer, one of their esteemed elders, who was on the brink of death. In these crucial moments, Stargazer requested a private audience with RECAPS. He sought to have a profound conversation with the tribe leader about a deeply existential question: the nature of what happens after death. This request marked a significant and reflective moment for both Stargazer and RECAPS, as they prepared to delve into the mysteries of life and the afterlife. Now on to the next part. Stargazer's question to RECAPS about the afterlife was a testament to his depth of insight as one of the more perceptive members of the black-scaled Lizardman tribe. But RECAPS, who is usually a figure of authority and knowledge within the tribe, found himself unexpectedly at a loss for words in response to this profound question. And despite being well-versed in the tales and rituals that the tribe held about death, and having witnessed significant battles where many warriors lost their lives, RECAPS realized the limitations of his knowledge on this subject. He had always offered prayers for the deceased, hoping they would find peace in a better place. However, he acknowledged the uncertainty that surrounded this belief. The true knowledge of what happens after death remained a mystery, one that he could not unravel until he himself passed away. And observing RECAPS' silence, which seemed to indicate he was carefully contemplating how to articulate his thoughts, Stargazer continued with his line of questioning. He pondered if the fate of the departed souls would enter a state of eternal dreaming, and if in such a dream, they lose their sense of identity and purpose, existing in a realm beyond comprehension. And the anxiety in his voice was evident, reflecting a deep concern about the unknown, a concern shared by RECAPS. But still, the question remained unanswered, and so Stargazer's questions then took a darker turn, asking if there is also a possibility of eternal nightmares. But RECAPS, who wasn't sure either, hesitated, and just asked why Stargazer thinks he is worthy enough to answer that question, showing to Stargazer that he was also in the dark about this subject. But Stargazer believes that RECAPS has a possible answer, he just doesn't know where to start looking for it. This prompted for Stargazer to offer his perspective on the subject. He reflected on how the blue insect god had been their guiding light during times of loss and despair. Based on this belief, he expressed hope that the same deity would continue to guide them in the afterlife. However, this was only a speculation of a mortal lizardman like him, and so he still felt the need to sought confirmation from RECAPS, asking if this notion aligned with God's will. And RECAPS pondered deeply over this profound question. After careful consideration, he agreed with Stargazer, affirming that the blue insect god, who had guided them in life, would likely extend that guidance beyond death. With this, Stargazer had a somewhat satisfied look on his face. Yet he delved deeper into the topic by asking RECAPS what kind of place he imagined the afterlife to be, prompting RECAPS to share his vision of the afterlife. He imagined it as a vast expanse, where one could run endlessly, feeling the ground crunch underfoot and the meadows gently brushing against one's tail. This depiction painted a picture of boundless freedom and comfort, a stark contrast to the limitations of their current physical forms. Stargazer, initially remarking on his own inability to run due to age, was reminded by RECAPS that in the afterlife, they would shed their old bodies. This realization brought a sense of nostalgia to Stargazer, who recalled the days of his youth when he could walk and run freely. Finding common ground in this shared vision, RECAPS further described a landscape where one could rest on a large boulder when tired, suggesting a serene and peaceful environment. This led Stargazer to inquire about the weather in such a place, which RECAPS immediately answered that it'll always be good. But he then took it back, as he thinks that it wouldn't be fun if it's always the same. So sometimes it'll be gloomy and rainy. And now that he thinks of it, it would also be nice if there's a river. And Stargazer, being encapsulated by RECAPS' vision, then added that he wants there to be a house that he can rest in, to which RECAPS responded that there would likely be various forms of shelter available, such as structures made of mud or wood, or even tents. However, Stargazer expressed a specific aversion to tents, revealing a deeper sentiment. He had grown weary of a nomadic lifestyle, which tents symbolized to him. The idea of constantly moving from one place to another had become unappealing to the elder, who now longed for a more permanent and stable dwelling. Upon hearing this, RECAPS realized that he hadn't fully understood Stargazer's experiences and feelings, so he apologized for not realizing it sooner. But Stargazer just shook his head, reassuring him that there was no need for regret, since he found a place for his heart to settle down at. So he has no other complaints while he is still alive. After he dies is the problem. And so RECAPS continued to elaborate on his vision of the afterlife, assuring Stargazer that the house he longed for would indeed exist there. A sturdy one that doesn't move anywhere. It might be a house built with rocks, offering the permanence and stability Stargazer craved. And with the topic of shelter settled, Stargazer's curiosity turned to the subject of food in the afterlife. And so RECAPS shared that he would probably always be able to eat as much as he wants. And it seems like everything would be there. But Stargazer thinks he might feel lonely being alone in a big place like that. But RECAPS shrugged, as he believed that Stargazer wouldn't be alone. There are already those who have gone before them, and even RECAPS and the others will all be there someday. So Stargazer won't be lonely, and when the time comes that they meet again, they can then talk about stars, as they still have lots to talk about. This surprised Stargazer, so he curiously asked RECAPS if he truly believes that there will be stars there as well, to which RECAPS immediately answered yes. Even he, who was unsure of the afterlife, replied as if it was obvious this time, and this was because the stars always show them the way. So there will be those who wander around lost there too, and God will have definitely put stars in the sky for them to easily find a way back. This reasoning resonated with Stargazer, bringing a smile to his face as he found solace in RECAPS' words. However, as the conversation drew to a close, Stargazer's energy seemed to wane, and as RECAPS was tending to Stargazer, he noticed a blue butterfly entered the tent and was trying to land on the back of his hand. It was a sign. An answer from the blue insect god, a sign of positivity. And so RECAPS smiled, as he now knows the blue insect god had been listening to their conversation. And so he excitedly pointed out to Stargazer if he sees this as well, while RECAPS slowly brought his hand in front of Stargazer's eyes, so the butterfly wouldn't fly away. However, there was no response from Stargazer, and for a moment, RECAPS feared the worst. So RECAPS was about to shake Stargazer's body, thinking he had died, but then he realized Stargazer was still with him, and was just quietly saying something, asking if he was still around, which RECAPS softly answered that he was. But now it was clear that Stargazer had lost his vision. Death was approaching for him. This realization filled RECAPS with a sense of sorrow, since the blue butterfly was known amongst the black-scaled lizardmen tribe as a sign of positivity, as well as miracles. Even if it wasn't this butterfly which glowed with a mysterious blue light, the lizardmen were always happy when they saw any blue butterfly, thinking it was a good sign, and Stargazer would certainly recognize it too. So RECAPS was agonizing, but then he suddenly remembered the small joke he would make with Stargazer. So he immediately asked Stargazer if he was still there, which he confirmed. And so RECAPS told him that he brought him a gift, and he will leave it here. And just like before, Stargazer knew that even if he declines RECAPS' gift, he would just be fooling around and sneak it somehow. And so Stargazer confidently murmured that he will find it right away this time, with a smile on his face. And as the last breath of Stargazer reached the blue butterfly flapped its wings and flew away from RECAPS' hand. RECAPS somehow knew it was his last breath. RECAPS lightly shook Stargazer's body while calling his name. And when he confirmed Stargazer was no longer breathing, he called the herbalist in, while the blue butterfly flew out of the tent and continued flying into the sky, over the black-scaled lizardmen tribe as they busily prepared for encampment and the funeral, then the wilderness where dusk had arrived. Finally, the blue butterfly landed on the back of another hand. It was Nebula, and he knew well what happens when someone dies in the lost world, and the conditions for creating the afterlife have been completed. So Nebula didn't hesitate to create it. Nebula knew he would eventually create an afterlife someday, after a player selected their first tribe, and the NPCs in the surrounding areas were defeated. A player's divinity level would reach 11. It was one of the required conditions to create an afterlife, and a player could reach the level if they played properly in the beginning. Then they would be called semi-deities. At that point on, it would be very difficult for XP to increase. Still, it doesn't matter for Nebula, as levels are only one of the additional factors to winning the game, and he is confident that no one would be at a higher level than he is right now. He is on the faster side of meeting all the conditions, level-wise, resource-wise, faith points-wise, and sufficient deaths. Each of these components played a significant role in his overarching plan, but the aspect of deaths held particular importance. This element was crucial in fulfilling the most vital condition for creating an afterlife within the game's universe. The 4 conditions Nebula focused on were interrelated yet distinct. Advancing to the requisite levels and defeating powerful NPCs like abominations and fiends to secure special resources, as well as gathering enough faith points, were relatively straightforward tasks. However, the last condition, related to death, was more enigmatic and complex, because once there were enough deaths of individuals that believed in the player, then the condition was known to be met. However, The specific formula for figuring out how many had to die was not provided in the Lost World, so the players had to make the calculations and figure it out themselves. There were cases where the condition wasn't fulfilled, no matter how many had died, and there were cases where the conditions were easily met after the death of only a few individuals. Some say that it depends on how much faith points the individual generated, but that doesn't necessarily add up to Nebula, so he can't figure out what it is. But he has already met the conditions, so he chose not to be bothered by it further, and just focus on what up ahead. With this in mind, Nebula then opened the World Creation Helper version 2. He knew there would come a day where he would create an afterlife. So he had been modeling different kinds of afterlife he wanted from time to time using the World Creation Helper version 2, which was provided by the Lost Worlds system. Just like the Creature Creation Helper Nebula used to make Stratus, there were worlds Nebula had created before, and worlds that other players had made saved in the World Creation Helper program. But just like last time, Nebula decided to make a new one, but the basic framework is pre-made, which was good. And he already knew what kind of afterlife each species preferred from his previous experiences in playing the game. While lizardmen all generally preferred the same type of afterlife, there was a certain kind of world lizardmen of a young civilization especially favored. Green fields with moist, humid air and warm sunny plains. And Nebula was somewhat relieved when he heard Rakrak and Stargazer imagining and talking about the afterlife, because the afterlife he created wasn't too different from their descriptions. Nebula continued preparing the afterlife by pressing here and there within the World Creation Helper tab. The souls of those who died while having faith in the player would remain rather than disappear. It was up to the players if they wanted to collect the souls, and most of the time, they were collected because that was the only way an afterlife could be created. The souls would be the first ones to set foot in the afterlife Nebula created, and he couldn't just pass on this opportunity, since the afterlife was a very important element within the Lost World, as it was a factor in determining the view of life after death for those who believed in a god. For example, if an afterlife of hell was created, a god could show priests the image of hell through dreams. The priests would then learn from the dreams that those who were wicked would receive eternal punishment, and they would then spread that fact to the other believers. That way, the priest can tell the believers to uphold morality and ethics, but there's another way to compel them to do so. The concept of hell could be changed depending on a player's abilities and utilization. There were multiple ways to inform believers of what could make them go to hell. Players could have priests tell believers that doing bad things would land them in hell, but they could also have believers think that attacking a certain species or insulting a specific god could lead to the same fate. This type of gameplay was common in the Lost World. It was also common for the concept of heaven to be used together with hell, but there would be no reason to believe in a god if hell was the only destination after death, since punishments should always be paired with rewards. And it was also possible to create a world where the believers believed that they would go to heaven if they attacked a certain species or insulted a specific god, and it was more than a matter of faith since this actually happened in the afterlife. But it wasn't possible for Nebula to create an afterlife of heaven and hell just yet, as he would need at least 2 afterlives, but he can only make 1 right now. And reincarnation is also difficult, because there would need to be judges. As a result, Nebula was only able to create a type of afterlife called different worlds, and this particular afterlife is useful and a commonplace throughout history, such as Valhalla, Water of Forgetfulness, Styx, Limbo. They're all different from each other, but they all indicate worlds you would go to after you die. These worlds weren't necessarily individual worlds on their own, but more often used as spaces leading to other afterlives. However, these weren't the only purposes for these worlds. Even in Valhalla, the afterlife was like a training place for warriors getting ready for Ragnarok. Afterlives can really differ depending on how the players want to use them, and now that he thinks about it, there was a time he even won by utilizing the afterlife. But he did just got lucky though, and that is because souls would be immortal as long as an afterlife existed. It was hard to make use of the knowledge or powers that the souls possessed, because it consumed a lot of faith points. But as the game progressed into the later stages, the souls would become very helpful to the players. Nevertheless, there's no need to rush from the start. Many things are still in their inceptions, and so he decided to think flexibly, and just went through the next step, and that is to name his newly created afterlife, which he didn't hesitate to name it the First Prairie. It was a working title, allowing possibility for future expansion. Then the first prairie that was visible in the World Creation Helper appeared below Nebula's feet. Nebula opened his possessions window and scattered all the souls into the first prairie. Hundreds of souls turned into blue wandering butterflies, and they landed on the grassland. As soon as the spirits that believed themselves to be butterflies landed on grass, flowers, and dirt, they remembered they used to be lizardmen and turned back into their original forms before they died. But in the first prairie, they realized they weren't injured. exhausted, or had deadly diseases. Meanwhile, Nebula concealed himself. There was a soul that Nebula needed to guide personally, and that is Stargazer, who is in a serene slumber upon a lush grass meadow, his rest so deep it was as if he had been craving it for ages. Unexpectedly, a gentle tingle on his snout stirred him awake. He thought he would be forever sleepy, but when he opened his eyes, he felt refreshed. Lying down, his arms, legs, and tail moved as he wished. He never thought that the pain in his joints would ever go away, even in a dream. With this, Stargazer sat up. Immediately, he was presented with an astonishing view, where at first he thought it was a dream, but as he felt everything in his presence, he denounced the thought, as he was now certain that all of this isn't a dream. It was a green grassland, a gentle, wind-swept past, and Stargazer felt the humid but cool air on his nose. He thought his nose felt cold at first, but soon felt the warmth of the sun on his face. All was good. Then Stargazer easily remembered the last conversation he had with RECAPS. The conversation seemed like it had been a dream, but at the same time so very real and vivid. As he reflected on their exchange, his eyes sparkled with realization. RECAPS had been right. This was the prairie they had envisioned together. However, he noticed the absence of stars and the lack of stone houses they had imagined. It dawned on Stargazer that one doesn't always receive everything they wish for. Perhaps, in this realm, houses were unnecessary. Still, this insight brought a smile to his face as he recognized the beauty and serenity of this gift from their god, where he found himself in a tranquil paradise, where the sun's warmth was gentle and comforting, never becoming overbearing, and before him stretched an endless expanse of grass, inviting him to run freely in any direction he desired. The breeze seemed to embrace him wholly, welcoming his entire being with open arms. In this moment, Stargazer felt a profound sense of peace and fulfillment, as if he had truly found a place where he belonged, a realm that resonated with his deepest desires and aspirations.